Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Avery Irons, and I'm the YGI's Director of Training and Technical Assistance. I would like to start today's webinar with a land acknowledgement and respectfully recognize that the University of Albany sits on the traditional homelands of the Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, and Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans. As a university, we are committed to cultivating reciprocal relationships with Indigenous communities, focused on equity, social justice, and sustainability, and dismantling legacies of colonization. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Margaret Robinson. Margaret is a Two-Spirit Mi'kmaq scholar and a citizen of the Lennox Island First Nation. Dr. Robinson regularly publishes on sexual and gender identity, Indigenous health, and factors shaping mental well-being. She is a co-investigator on a multi-site study examining how tuition waiver programs for former youth in care can increase their access to post-secondary education, a project funded by a partnership development grant from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We're so excited for her to lead today's discussion on the mental health needs of Two-Spirit youth. Without further ado, Dr. Robinson, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, I'm Dr. Margaret Robinson. As Avery mentioned, I'm a Mi'kmaq scholar. I'm an enrolled member of Lennox Island First Nation, so if you were to write to them, they would know who I am. On the right is my grandmother, Margot Paul. We called her Margie. She was born on Lennox Island, but most of her family have lived in Halifax. We've had Robinsons now in Halifax for 5 generations. I'm one of those Robinsons. On the lower left is a picture of her son, my father, James Paul Robinson, and also on the lower left is my mother, Heather McLean. And so just to give you sort of a context of where I'm located, my views are my perspective on the literature, but other people might see things differently. So I'm a Two-Spirit person, and I've conducted research with other Two-Spirit people since 2012. Maybe Avery, this would be a good time to launch those polls and get a sense of what are the participants, the audience folks, what's your experience been with Two-Spirit people? And is there a particular age group that you work with? Maybe while folks are doing that, I'll explain what I mean by Two-Spirit. Traditionally, Two-Spirit referred to people who combined masculine and feminine in some way in their gender presentation and community role. So historical research indicates that many Indigenous nations frame this as a third gender, or sometimes if they split it into masculine and feminine, as a third and fourth gender. So we also see this reflected in language. So for example, in Anishinaabe people might refer to a gokwe, which is a man who is also a woman. Or they might have a person who identifies as a gokwe nini, which is a woman who is also a man. Similarly, among the Navajo, also called the Diné, were the Nodle, which some folks have translated as the changing ones. So there are indigenous gender descriptions that have been brought forward, but Two-Spirit is one of the first ones that is usually applied right across the continent. And that comes from the anthropology history of naming things for the entire continent. Let's see. Oh, folks, which age group of Two-Spirit people do you serve? Well, okay, I see lots of adolescents, but also some emerging adults and some adults. And then some of you aren't serving Two-Spirit people at all. Great, that's good to know. And then how familiar are you with mental health needs of Two-Spirit youth? This is the area in which I work and have since I first started getting into Indigenous research. This was my first area of Indigenous research, was Two-Spirit mental well-being. Mainly because as a Two-Spirit person myself, this was an area I saw my community struggling. And so the literature reflects a lot of what I've seen, particularly egregious disparities in PTSD, in anxiety and depression, in suicidality, so suicidal feelings, considerations of suicide, sometimes a suicide attempt might be included under that category, and then high rates of substance use. Okay, so it looks like most of the folks never heard anything about it. That's why I'm here. Know a little bit, but not much. Know about it, but want to know more. Oh, that's wonderful. That's a great point for starting. So of these, PTSD is the only one that I haven't led work on yet. But if you're looking for more information about sort of the rates of particular mental health issues for Two-Spirit people, you can take a look at my 22 article for current opinion in psychology, which details all of those. And that's available open access on the web. So why do we see these mental health problems? Well, to understand Two-Spirit health, we have to relate it to what we know about healthy Indigenous communities more broadly. And so here we see three enormous stressors. Um, the first of these is Indian boarding schools. In Canada, we call these residential schools. But they're the same sort of idea, this idea of forced cultural separation, so taking children away from their communities, forced religious conversion, and also often these were sites of extreme physical and sexual violence. And so we see more severe mental health impacts for men who attended these institutions than for women. Research has also found negative impacts not only in the survivors of people from Indian boarding schools, but also in those whose parents or grandparents were held there. And so we've called this impact intergenerational trauma in the field. And so you may often hear people talk about trauma-informed approaches to mental health treatment or to various other issues involving Indigenous communities. And this is partly why, because of the trauma that people experienced at Indian boarding schools. So for instance, in Canada, Ian Mosby has done research showing that the government performed nutritional experiments on children because they wanted to take advantage of their already malnourished condition to find out if different interventions would work well for soldiers. If this history is unfamiliar to you, I encourage you to check out KGW8's Portland's The Dark History of Indian Boarding Schools. I've put that link in the reference slide, and I'll share those slides with you when we're done. A number of studies also identify high rates of poverty as a mental health stressor. So here's a cut of data from a 2022 study by Around Him and Gordon. And here we see that American Indian and Alaska Natives are likely to live in poverty more so than many other groups in the US. So this finding in the image is on the right here, highlighted in blue. Now, one of the things I find interesting about this is that we see a lower percentage of Indigenous children in poverty compared with the group overall. And so I think it's possible that the rate of child poverty here reflects the high number of children held in care by the state. So Indigenous youth generally make up only 1% of children overall, but they're 2% of youth in care. And that's a statistic that's pretty recent from 2022. So research in Canada has identified the effects of poverty as a primary reason for child apprehension in Indigenous communities. And if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to look at the work of Cindy Blackstock. A third factor shaping mental health for Two-Spirit people and their communities is violence. And the literature shows high rates of all sorts. And this definitely came out for me in the Two-Spirit Roundtable research, where people described some very upsetting experiences of violence. But in general, we see a range of violent experiences reported by Two-Spirit people. Everything from state violence, so civil rights violations, destruction of sacred sites, theft of cultural or territorial resources, to high rates of social violence, sexualized violence, and interpersonal violence, including from other community members and sometimes even family members. So the upshot of this is that community connection is not always violent-free for Two-Spirit people. And given their weight in the literature, to improve mental health for Two-Spirit people, we have to think really seriously about what do we do about violence, poverty, and intergenerational trauma. Research by and with Two-Spirit people has identified several needs for this community. One of these is the need to grieve and heal from the cultural loss. And Duran and Duran have identified this as a need for Indigenous people more broadly and have referred to it as a soul wound of colonialism. A second need is for restored cultural and language supports. Participants in my Two-Spirit Roundtable, for example, noted the value of culture and spirituality to support their well-being. And a recurring theme in that was the importance of gender. so gender-specific groups as cultural supports. And then what we see in the literature more broadly is a benefit of community control over services to maximize outcomes. And I'll circle back to this later. I'll now talk about one intervention aimed at reducing poverty, which is tuition assistance. There are three main types of tuition waiver programs in the US that my team looked at. The first of these is organizational. So, for instance, a college or a university might run a waiver program, waiving the tuition for their specific institution. And then other types of institutions, other types of programs are run by the state. So 28 states offer tuition assistance for former youth in care, for instance. But each program is different. There's no standard age criteria, no standard number of openings available each year. What expenses they cover may vary from program to program, and what schools or programs are eligible for this kind of assistance can also vary. Some have mandatory community service hours required of beneficiaries, which could reduce their study time or carry stigma associated with criminality because people may associate doing community service work, especially mandated community service work, with having committed a crime. And then the third is national programs. And so, for example, there's free application for federal student aid, which you may be familiar with. And then there's the John H. Chaffee Foster Care Independence Program, which is available to former youth in care. And students registered in that program are linked to the National Youth in Transition database, where a number of factors are tracked on them until they reach age 21. So to sum, if you're a youth in care and you want to go to university, there's a complicated patchwork of tuition waiver programs and awards, only some of which you can use together, and each have different applications and processes. So we're looking at a steep learning curve for students. The point being, of course, that systems require streamlining and redesign if they're going to improve their impact and their uptake rates. So if you want more Two-Spirit people going to university on a tuition waiver, support to navigate all of these multiple systems would be helpful. I'm currently involved in a study about tuition waiver programs led by Dr. Jackie Gahagan at Mount St. Vincent University. And we've been looking at research published since 1997. And most of the studies that we looked at collected information using interviews or surveys, and most of them were done in the US. So the US seems to be the leader in this kind of research. There were a few studies from the UK and Australia and Japan and Hungary, but Canada didn't have any at all. So in that regard, you're way ahead. And the literature identified several factors that helped former youth in care succeed in education after high school. What helped was unconditional care and support from trusted adults. And I think this really links in with the importance of relationality for Indigenous communities. So specifically, there was importance attached to continuity. It had to be the same person over time, that same adult who is providing the support and has the relationship of trust with the person. And then high educational expectations from caregivers, so care providers, and school staff. And then also increased educational supports like tutoring. So if students succeeded, it was because they were expected to succeed and they were given the resources to do so. Several factors stood out as detrimental for success. And the main theme of these was the damaging impact of instability. So this is any kind of instability in school registration, in their finances, in their access to transportation, in their housing situation, or their access to social support. And so here's where something like coming out could impact your access to social support, as well as housing and finances and things like that. But we can't always control the stability factors. So I would also emphasize the benefit of what they call wraparound supports. And these are the supports that assist someone who is already receiving the benefit. So for instance, you might include culturally informed mental health care as a wraparound support for Two-Spirit people accessing a tuition waiver. And also the benefit of peer cohorts for success. So for example, this image comes from, this image here on the left comes from the Mi'kmaq and Black initiative at Dalhousie University. It's been running since 1989, and it aims to increase the number of Mi'kmaq and Black students in the legal profession. And they've had 217 graduates in that program since. So this creates a cohort of folks who are all in relatively similar circumstances with similar educational aims, which can assist with that identity of oneself as a student or a scholar. The literature also identifies a number of qualities that support success for former youth in care, and these include self-determination, motivation, and perseverance. And these are needed because the systems are so confusing and so complicated. People who receive tuition waivers also report needing financial assistance beyond tuition for things like books, housing, sometimes other needs. The option of remaining in care until after age 18 would also be beneficial. Many tuition recipients reported being seasonally homeless as residents closed for the holidays. And then the last thing that they asked for were activities, social events to connect with peers. And I think that one may be particularly helpful as well. So this image comes from Cornell University's engineering program, which offers support through their American Indian Science and Engineering Society. And so here, you're not just offering the tuition waiver, you're offering a peer group with which they can connect and come to identify themselves as engineers specifically. And then to close, I'll return to my point about community control. We see better mental health outcomes in places where Indigenous governments control their own services. So this might be education, child welfare, health, police, fire, where cultural values and language are strong as well. We see better outcomes. So if we restore the ability of Indigenous nations to address poverty, violence, and trauma, then we'll see better mental health outcomes for Two-Spirit people. And that's something that I've written about in relation to issues like development, where governments often don't include Two-Spirit people in decision making. I think maybe I'll stop here and I'll say Walali Ok, which is thanks to all of you. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I'm happy to answer your questions. And I've compiled a number of references that I will share when I share my slides with folks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Margaret, for all of that information. So now we'll transition into a few questions that we have from the YGI, and we'll kind of blend that in with the questions that are coming in from the audience. So I kind of want to just start and think about your discussion of cultural reconnection and healing. And so one of the things I was thinking about when I read one of your articles, it's what is the balance, especially for Two-Spirit youth and adults, between kind of the need to reconnect to culture, but then if you also have rejecting elements in that culture? So is it, part is okay, like maybe the reconnection to language, or is it, how does that balance between harm and help?
That's a great question, Avery. And the people in the research projects that I've done, the studies I've led, have had trouble teasing those apart. So one of the things they mention often is the difficult search for elders who are both knowledgeable about Two-Spirit identity and supportive of it. And so sometimes people will want to increase their language knowledge, for instance, but then be exposed to transphobia or homophobia in order to do so. And so people have, there's a bit of a word of mouth thing that goes around where, like, if you find an elder who is Two-Spirit positive, who is queer friendly, who maybe is okay with you choosing what you want to wear to ceremony, those sort of elders, people recommend them to each other in the community. And so having a Two-Spirit community that is sort of nestled within other Indigenous communities, especially in urban spaces, is often what I've seen develop, because many of their needs just aren't getting met through the usual channels.
It makes sense. And actually, it's a part of a follow-up you mentioned in urban communities. I guess I'm curious about the difference that you've seen between urban communities and also youth experiences in rural communities.
Oh, yeah. So I've lived in both of these situations. I grew up in a very rural community and then went to university and was in suddenly some of the most urban spaces in the country. So it's an interesting difference. In rural spaces, there are often so few resources. And so as communities have been economically suppressed for generations, there may not be the kinds of mental health supports that you might see in a larger city, but there's often greater cultural continuity. And
Mm,
so the culture and language might be a lot more intact in a rural space. And in rural areas, people live on less, but fewer people live below poverty markers or identify as poor because family and community belonging is stronger. And so people have more of a social safety net. And so, for instance, here, if people in Mi'kmaq communities are food insecure, there's a communal freezer where local hunters will deliver wild game that people can access. Or if people have additional food that they share with other community members, that goes to the community fridge. Um, and then rural resilience is often around sharing those resources and the ability to engage with folks beyond the family or the community for additional supports. Um, but then maximizing money and status are not necessarily indigenous values here. And so the aim that we see is really more around having a moderate livelihood and the ability to live according to your core values. And so in urban space, there's a lot more employment. And so the moderate livelihood element is sometimes a little more accessible. But in
mm,
urban space, there may be also service hubs like cultural centers, but less community and social support. So more individuals living in poverty. And so what we see in an urban space is more likely situations where people share their strategies for navigating support systems rather than sharing their resources directly.
mhm,
But urban places, urban cities have been serving Indigenous communities for quite a while now, and half of Indigenous communities in Canada, anyway, live in an urban center. So they're increasingly being seen as places where we should expect Indigenous people to be seeking services. Whereas it's not always the case in a rural space. If they don't know that they have a really clear Indigenous community, they may not expect to have Indigenous people coming for services.
mm, mm. That makes sense. Thank you. So next question is I'm curious about historically there's kind of this need for how do you develop models around building acceptance of LGBTQIA plus two spirit identities um, in all communities. And so, there's been work around family acceptance models here in the US. And I'm curious, is there anything that is developing in Canada or around two spirit youth or people in general to kind of do this? How do we increase support while also reducing rejecting behaviors that young people may be experiencing from elders, family members, community members?
What I've seen here is that folks who are involved in what we might call new traditionalism, what previous folks might have called walking the red road, so a re-embracing of cultural values and cultural practices. These are often focused on action, so doing cultural activities. But new traditionalism has also engaged cultural values and looked at how to live them in a non-rural or urban space. And so I think there's some benefits there in terms of models for two-spirit inclusion, because a lot of the leaders in urban work have been two-spirit people. And so I think that new traditionalism enables people to um, have a reason for talking about two-spirit involvement, especially if two-spirit people were already part of their pre-colonial gender systems. And so looking at how can we restore two-spirit people to the roles they had in communities, or to develop new community roles for two-spirit people that really draw on their skill set. Um, I think that can be done within new traditionalism. And sometimes you'll see that here with communities where maybe the older generation are all devoted to a particular Christian sect that was associated maybe with the residential school that they attended.
Mhm.
But the younger generations are more interested in rediscovering their traditional roots. And so that can sometimes be a bit of a split in the community that goes along generational lines.
That makes sense, and it feels like that would be really complicated to address because you have the experiences of the people who are young people now, or even adults, and then you have the other experiences, and you have to kind of work along all of them if we're thinking about a healing framework and a reconnection framework.
Yeah, and so we've seen instances where like some indigenous governments got angry because some of their members were holding a sweat lodge or something, because they'd see that as something that isn't according to their religious values, because it's more traditional. And so that can be a source of conflict in addition to uh, issues of homophobia or transphobia or lack of support.
Mm.
Um, but then there's also great work being done there. So Native Youth Sexual Health Network, it has been youth run and engaging elders. And so I think that kind of a model of involving people who are at both ends of that life cycle journey to engage together for making change, I think is really promising.
Excellent. So, question from the audience. Can you speak about the relationship between two-spirit individuals and the larger transgender, gender nonconforming communities? What are some of the benefits and barriers of this relationship for two-spirit people, maybe in more urban areas?
Sure. So the impression I get is that because two spirit communities are so small, because indigenous communities are relatively small, that you don't see the kind of splitting up into smaller and smaller groups based on maybe the distinct experiences that someone who is, say, genderqueer identified might have compared to someone who is not genderqueer. And so some of the types of community engagement and types of identity development that we would see in a large urban space of settlers doesn't necessarily happen in an indigenous space where people are more used to flexible identities. They don't necessarily expect that there's one right way to do things. They expect people's experience of their identity to change over time throughout the life cycle. And so there's a lot more flexibility to community belonging. Uh, like, so, if when I came out as bisexual, if I had done so after already having taken up a lesbian identity, I might lose my lesbian community in order to come out as bisexual. Whereas in an indigenous context where everyone is together in the same group, changes like that don't necessarily require losing that community support. And so there's this came up for me in bisexual research because I was trying to connect with two spirit people who were bisexual, and all my elders were like, that's not really how it works. Like, we don't slice it up that finely.
Mm.
And so yeah, the relationship can be fraught because people are trying to grapple with and sometimes invent the language to describe their lived truths,
Mm.
whereas indigenous people have a history that comes with who they see themselves as that is not necessarily the same history that their other peers are going to have in a gender nonconforming or trans spaces. And so it can be challenging for two spirit people to be read correctly, to feel like they're really seen by other people, and to sometimes they may feel that they have to explain everything to everyone and answer all their questions, no matter how silly or invasive, which I'm sure is a experience many folks have had. But yeah, the difficulty is often around colonial histories. People often don't know them, and so they may not see how they're related to identity.
Mm. Mm. Well said. We have a question actually about uh, pronouns and two-spirit identities. Can you say a little bit about kind of how that variability might work for two-spirit
Sure.
individuals?
So I see a lot of folks who are very comfortable sharing their pronouns. And so that's where I've picked up the practice of I use she, her, but I'll also use they occasionally. And so I see a lot of that kind of flexibility of people who maybe they'll use feminine pronouns, maybe they'll use masculine ones, maybe they'll use plural. And it may shift depending on the audience they're with. And so many two-spirit people were very attentive to whom were they speaking when they were going to share something about their identity or their experience. Because if they're with other indigenous people, they might identify as two-spirit, but if they're with community members, they might use an indigenous language pronoun or an indigenous language identity term. And so one I see sometimes at home is negum, which is a Mi'kmaq pronoun that is gender neutral. We might say it's the equivalent of like that person.
Mm.
And so I've been seeing more and more people using that online, Mi'kmaq people using a traditional non-gendered pronoun in their own language, which I think is really exciting to see.
Thank you for breaking that down. We appreciate it. So I want to shift a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of the research. And so some of this will get a little practicey to the extent that you're able to. But so you said that the data you showed, just in the data in some of your articles, just reflects formidable inequities for
Mhm.
two-spirit youth.
Yeah.
Are there models of successful interventions for states and localities to follow in addressing disparities? Are there things that you've seen in Canada or the US or elsewhere?
Yeah, culturally rooted interventions have been very successful. So in my own work, I've seen great outcomes with what we call here talking circles. If you're not familiar with the talking circle, it's essentially a big round circle of group of people in a circle, and you pass around an object. Here, it's often an eagle feather, and the person with the object is permitted to talk for as long as they want about pretty much anything they want. I sometimes use it for data collection, but we also use it for other things, discussion or data analysis. And when I talk to people about their experience of doing the process, many of them said they had never been in a space, especially if they were femininely gendered in some way or in other positions that made them be seen by others as potentially socially vulnerable. They had never been in a space where people didn't interrupt them when they spoke. And so I think that that powerful experience of just being able to talk it out with like-minded people who are just there to listen,
Mm,
because there are protocols about the talking circle that you don't comment on what other people have said. You only speak from your own experience. And so I think it can create opportunities for people to have safer conversations. A number of research projects and personal conversations have also emphasized that gender is really important.
mm,
So remembering that violence and trauma are highly gendered. And so if we're going to do an intervention, it also needs to be really attentive to gender. And so I see a lot of activities where people want to do it with other folks who have similar genders to themselves.
mm,
So for instance, here, some of the work that I do in food sovereignty is related to work that women do in hunting and butchering animals and preparing foods for community members, for instance, making broth for people who just had a baby, that kind of thing. And so gendered activities. And then engaging two-spirit organizations. So here, the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance is pretty active in research and cultural intervention activities. In fact, they started as an intervention to prevent suicide among queer and other two-spirit youth in their communities here. And so then there's also the Northeast Two-Spirit Society and the East Coast Two-Spirit Society in the same coastline. And then the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, as I mentioned, does work right across the country. And they get together with elders and youth to bead condoms. Now, it creates a condom you can't use, but
how does that work?
it introduces a conversation. It breaks down some of those barriers. It helps youth realize that elders are still sexual people. And it gives you an opportunity to learn a bit about beading while also learn a bit about safer sex practices. And so I think some of those interventions that have elements of humor at the same time that they support peer and culture, those seem really promising to me.
Mm, excellent, thank you. And you kind of anticipated my next question, so I'll ask you just to see if there's anything else you would add to that. But and I'll take it in two parts actually. Just recommendations for service providers to follow or to contact or to reach out to. So is there anyone else that you would recommend that folks, especially on this side of the Canadian border, might want to look at, people who release national resources or information? And then I'd add a second caveat to that, and just for people who want to learn more about kind of two-spirit identities and things like how being two-spirit uh, works in tandem with like attraction and all those things, are there kind of those two-spirit 101 type of resources that you would recommend?
There's not as much Two Spirit 101 as you might think. And I think some of that is partly because our communities are often communicating verbally rather than in text. So we don't produce a whole bunch of text about our identities as much as we might if we were part of a different group. But there's a lot of videos that are available and by contrast. And so some of that is very helpful. In terms of engaging resources for cultural and peer support, there's a site called wearenative.org that I've found very cool. They offer culturally informed advice delivered in a cultural way. So it's mostly about engaging with people who are volunteers framed as cousins, uncles, and aunties who answer questions from Indigenous youth about cultural issues. So they showcase video responses to common questions, like, will my dad disown me if I come out as bi? And so they've got some really contemporary questions that they're looking at, and they have, it's almost like a little video chat with someone from your community or someone who could be someone from your community. And so I think that's a really great resource because it enables people to connect for information and support in a way that is delivered in a culturally appropriate manner. And I think that's really the key combo is that you want not only the content to be relevant, but the envelope, the matter of delivery. And so, yeah, I think We Are Native was a great site for that. Two-Spirit Peoples of the First Nations is also a long-standing Canadian Two-Spirit organization who've organized most of the early research in this country about Two-Spirit people. They're still doing lots of work. And a lot of organizations that started off doing HIV work in our communities are also sites of Two-Spirit support and intervention and mental health work, particularly because they see that all is connected up very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Alicia from our YGI team just dropped in the wearenative.org link in the chat. So please, everyone, check that out. So thinking about supports, this conversation is reminding me of a presentation that we had in November about kind of housing first approaches to helping young people stabilize who are unhoused. So I'm wondering if, when you talked earlier during your presentation about kind of the factors that need support around housing, finances, health supports, all those things, is there a recommended starting place or is it very individual? Like, is there a base, a core support that, providers should really focus on and then kind of let everything else fall in place?
Yeah, I think housing is really one of the first upstream factors that if people can be securely housed somewhere that is reliable, that gives them a long-term mailing address, that gives them a safe place to study and to have privacy, that's really essential. Poverty can be worked around, but a lack of housing, it creates this cascade of all kinds of other issues that in many ways prevent people from accessing services or being treated respectfully when they do access services. And so, if I'm living in my car and I haven't showered for 3 days and I go to access services, I'm going to be treated very differently than if I come in with my clothes pressed because I had a place to do that. And so there are, I think that the housing piece is really essential, especially for people who are already really vulnerable in many other ways. To then add in the homelessness issue can really be devastating. And so I think especially for students who are pursuing education, we need to plug that gap and address those sort of vacation homelessness situations where, because the university residence isn't available, they now have to find a place to live. And so if there are ways to introduce flex space or flex time into people's ability to access care and access housing through care, I think that could be very helpful.
I was going to say, have you seen any models that work at the university level for that, kind of those vacation closures?
That's challenging because the universities here often make money by renting out those spaces in the summer. And so anything you propose is potentially digging into that source of revenue. And so I think it could be engaged as a wraparound support. That way you can frame it as an in-kind that the institution is offering to make these spaces available, and that can be recognized by their funders as something that is valuable for the community. And so I think if it's something that they're able to identify and attach a price to, a value to, then I think we're much more likely to have them be able to incorporate that into at least institutional level supports for former youth in care.
Mm, thank you. Um, so I wanted to, you talked about kind of tuition waivers as a social support. And so I'm curious about um, the impacts you've seen from that. Um, how has, have we been able to study, we, royal we, been able to study um, the kind of long-term impacts or kind of college stability, college retention, completion rates for young people who are able to access that type of support?
Yeah, so just accessing the support helps. And then if there are wraparound supports attached to that, then those help additionally. And
Mm,
so when we looked at the literature review, we did see outcomes that were just related to getting the tuition waived.
mm,
But there's more to going to university than just paying your tuition. And so if the ideal and most impactful programs had that whole view, that like sort of bird's eye understanding of what life in academia is like for students. So that thought about how are people getting from their classes to the grocery store, or that thought about where are people going to be able to get secondhand books, or with whom are they going to study, those kind of things. And so some places have had success creating little residence spaces that are distinct for particular groups that are accessing, say, tuition waiver services, or that are part of groups that are marginalized in other ways. And so something like a floor that's for Indigenous students, for instance, can help create safe space on campus, even without other supports around them.
thank you. Let's see. And I guess I would say, are there any, you've mentioned a few, but I want to just ask the question explicitly. Are there any other social programs that you would recommend that have had kind of high levels of positive impacts?
Social programs for Two-Spirit people?
Mhm.
Yeah, so a number of Two-Spirit organizations hold Two-Spirit gatherings.
Mm,
And these are activities, events that draw people from other countries sometimes, other states, other areas, and they're often annual opportunities for Two-Spirit people to get together and talk about what's going on in their community, to meet with other Two-Spirit people, to often engage in cultural activities. So, for instance, the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance recently held a gathering in Mi'kma'ki, and so I attended, and it was my first time being there. And I was really struck by how different being in Two-Spirit only space was, because I've been in space just filled with other Two-Spirit people, but it was usually for a research project. And so usually you're in Indigenous space that has some Two-Spirit people in it, or I'm in queer space that has some other Two-Spirit people in it. But we don't often have our own spaces just for Two-Spirit folks. And so, as with many communities, the less you have to explain in a social interaction, the less stressful many of that interaction is going to be for folks. And so this created space where people didn't have to explain what being Indigenous was. They didn't have to explain what Two-Spirit was. They
mm,
could just be themselves and have all of those things kind of understood in a way that they might not have experienced previously. And I
mm,
think one of the interesting side effects to that was around body image, that it was a very body positive space. And that I remember one woman speaker talking about how she felt so welcomed and not judged based on her size or her gender, that people just accepted her for who she was as an individual.
mhm.
And I think that's very true of a lot of Two-Spirit space at its best, and a lot of Indigenous space at its best. And so I think those kind of social supports, especially for people whose communities are not so welcoming yet, can be life-saving.
And what you just said makes me think about something I read in one of your articles, a phrase that I wanted to ask you about. So you discussed, and I want to see if you could say more about coming out versus coming in
Mm.
for two-spirit people.
Yeah, so this was one of the first concepts I came across that was different. So coming out is when I tell myself or someone else that I'm different. This might risk our relationship if they can't adjust to their changed expectations of who I am and what my life would look like. So when I came out to my parents, they struggled trying to figure out like what might her relationships look like now.
Mhm.
Coming in is when I understand myself or I'm understood by others to be taking up a two-spirit role in community life. So it's about what's your involvement in community and what kinds of contributions are you going to be able to make. And so it took me a while to identify as two-spirit because I struggled with that question of like, so I don't have ceremonial training. I don't have some of the skill sets that other two-spirit people have traditionally had. What's mine going to be? And so being able to see Two Spirit as an identity that is about community service is, to my way of thinking, what coming in is as a concept. It's about being embraced by your community and being acknowledged as a community member first. Um, Whereas coming out is often about losing community or embracing a community of outsiders. And so it's a different relation to the norm of the group. More work on this. I think if you want to know more about it, Dr. Alex Wilson at the University of Saskatchewan is the first place I saw work done on this.
Mhm.
And this is where focus groups with Two Spirit women identified that many of them didn't have a coming out, that relatives had always understood them as Two Spirit from the time they were small. Some of them had told them so and said, you seem like you might be Two Spirit, and here's what that means in our culture. And so a lot of folks that I've talked to since who are Two Spirit have had similar, what I would call coming in experiences, where particular family or community members told them what their difference meant and how it could be used to serve the community.
Mhm. So I think we've struck a nerve in the audience, a good nerve. And so
Mm,
folks are saying, can you please repeat the definition of coming in? I think they really want to capture your words and
sure.
explanation for it.
So coming in is when I understand myself or when I'm understood by others to be taking up a two spirit role in community. It's specifically a relational identity to community and to indigenous community specifically. Uh, so it's connecting you with a history and with a people, a specific people, some most cases. So for me, it was about figuring out what's my relation to the Mi'kmaq, to my Mi'kmaq communities. And then for other folks, it might be different depending on what their community's history with Two Spirit people look like. It's about connecting up with that specific history.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Uh, I see the question, is this the same as inviting in? A bit, yeah. So there's similar practice there, which is about prioritizing group belonging. So I have a Indigenous student that I was supervising who's very involved in activism. And when we disagreed on something, she came to meet with me to call me in. She felt I had done something that she didn't like, and she wanted to call me accountable for it in a way that maintained the value of our relationships and community connections. And so it's very similar, I think, where it's the idea about what's the priority in the engagement. And so Two Spirit identity often prioritizes that community belonging, where like you can be queer all by yourself, uh, but it's um, it would be more challenging to be Two Spirit all by yourself
Mm,
because of that. The assumptions about relationality and territory are really embedded in Indigenous ways of knowing, and so it really connects up into all of that.
mm. Thank you. Um, so are there, when we're thinking about two-spirit people, young people, mental health, kind of getting people to thriving, are there particular areas for research that you think that are understudied or that, researchers or scholars need to kind of delve into more?
Yeah, and I'm guilty of this myself. So our communities are asking for less, what we might call negative or deficit-based research. That they're basically saying like, this is really depressing. We know how bad things already are. We don't need more research that proves that, because a lot of the research we were doing in our communities was trying to prove to outside folks, government agencies often, that there was a problem in a specific area and that resources were needed. And so our communities are tired of that kind of research. They want to see research that engages with joy and that serves the communities better. So, for instance, Jesse Went, who's a Canadian broadcaster and an Indigenous media person, has talked about more. We should approach Indigenous stories in the press, particularly, but I also apply this to research with looking for the joy. And I think a lot of our research has not looked at the joy; it has only looked at the problem. And so I think it's missed a lot of the skills and the resources that we have in that interpersonal aspect. And if we're not seeing the whole picture, if we're only looking at the negative side, then we're not really understanding the people that we're trying to serve or our communities either. So I think it's an important shift to make to start looking for the joy.
Love that as someone in the audience. Um, so just a quick follow up on that. You Are there particular research tactics that you found to be particularly effective, or is there research? I guess another way we could take it is there research that can help systems engage better with two-spirit people?
Yeah, so something that came through in my research is that the two-spirit people that I interviewed and collected data from were highly educated. Many of them had university degrees, but their employment history was often very spotty or curtailed, that they just weren't getting the kind of employment roles that you would expect for someone with their educational background. And so here we can see the impact of that intersection where colonialism and racism and homophobia and transphobia are all coming together. And so looking for opportunities to employ two-spirit people in roles that help them serve their community, I think is important to do in research that sort of puts their community first, making them empowered really to make the decisions about the research, to decide what the questions are going to be, to decide what kind of methods you're going to use to collect the data, and to be active participants in all those discussions about how do we preserve this knowledge and whose knowledge does this whose knowledge does it belong to? Is there a community that this data needs to go back to, or that will be holding the data in perpetuity? And so thinking about how research can contribute to community building, community preservation, and to the restoration of our cultures and our economies. I think those are all things we need to think about. So, I mean, I do community-based research, so it's a little easier because there's a community of practice around that.
Mhm.
And so engaging in those connections to understand what the community of practice looks like is really helpful there.
That's excellent, and always a great reminder. Who does the research go back to? Like, who does it belong to? Um, so I think last question. Sometimes I like to sneak in two, but I think I limit myself to one. And I just what you said made me think about something that had occurred to me earlier in the presentation about a support is having high educational expectations
Yeah.
for young people and two-spirit young people. I'm curious about kind of how do you balance this in a world where it's also, they're working against in the face of systemic and structural barriers. And so your statements about kind of high educational attainment, but like kind of spotty employment records, it's like how do you how can practitioners in the most effective, positive way kind of bring those expectations while also recognizing and helping young people navigate these very long standing barriers?
Uh, Having someone who will sit with you and while you fill out the application can be really helpful.
Mm,
Someone who can answer the questions that I might feel as an applicant I'm embarrassed to ask, or that who can help you navigate through all of those processes. So, especially with the state-run pieces, where it's so patchwork that they differ so dramatically. Having people who are able to navigate those systems, guide others through those systems, has worked in the health field, where they have what they call system navigators, So Indigenous people come in for health services, they connect to their Indigenous system navigator who helps them and accompanies them through their hospital journey, and who knows how things get done in a hospital space. And so having someone who knows how things get done in a university space can be really helpful. So, I have a Canada Research Chair. I'm mid-career and have led lots of research. But if I hadn't looked up myself to find out that I could go to university from grade 11, I don't think any of my advisors would have told me that, because I grew up with low educational expectations from people at my school who thought that, if I really worked hard, I could maybe do administrative work somewhere. I think they kind of envisioned that sort of 1960s secretary scenario. Like the expectations can be heavily layered with, like, it's shaped by your gender, it's shaped by your age, it's shaped by your race. And so all of those factors, lots of students are ineligible because they've been streamed into non-academic high school experiences that would never have qualified them to go to university. And so you have to start really early. And so I think we need to look then at system change. How we engage youth in ideas about university has to start really before junior high, because by the time a lot of that streaming has occurred, you're already well into the years when they would have been able to make a change that made a difference on the other end. And many students don't understand how their grades relate to university admissions. So being able to let people know that, it might seem like a math test right now, but that it could be your admission into MIT.
Excellent. Thank you. And someone says thank you for the insight in the audience. Thank you so much, Margaret. This has been a wonderful conversation. You've shared so much information with us. I will remind everybody that Margaret is allowing us to share the slides, so you will receive those. Thank you so much for all of the resources. I think we'll try to kind of do a list of everything that you listed. It was such a, a rich list that you provided. But before I move into closing announcements, I want to pass it back to you for any final thoughts you have for us.
Oh gosh, I think a final thought would be that Two-Spirit people are really bright, and they're often the leaders in our communities. And so we can't go into work assuming that we're there to help or save. That they already often know the solutions to the problems in their lives. And so it's really about empowering people to make those changes that they know experientially and academically need to be made. And so I keep coming back to that aspect about community control. If communities can make their own decisions and do their own control over these kind of services, then we see stronger outcomes for Indigenous folks, particularly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Margaret. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thanks for having me here, Avery.
Absolutely. So in a moment, we will launch a poll question asking how much you agree or disagree with the statements. The webinar was informative and the webinar was engaging. Please answer these questions so that we may best know how our webinars are supporting you in your work. Sorry, I lost my page, which is problem. So if you have not already done so, please feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. And while everyone is answering the poll questions, I will say the next YGI Lunch and Learn webinar session will be held on Tuesday, April 9th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time with Dr. James Tuttle. His presentation is titled The End of Age Crime Curve, Implications of Recent Trends in Teenage Offending. Immediately following this webinar, we will send a survey to you all via email. Please complete the survey as it allows us to provide further feedback and questions for us. This information is also used to improve future webinar sessions. The survey should take no longer than 5 minutes, and we will also put the link for this survey in the chat section now. So just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. In closing, I want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YGI Lunch and Learn series. I'd especially like to thank Mira, Brianna, Nick, and Alicia for crewing the ship today, as many of our colleagues are out and about on various YGI projects. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about what Dr. Robinson has presented to us today. We look forward to seeing you at future YGI events.